Hello and welcome back to the final part of Oddtober, a series in which we've been covering all of the main series Oddworld games in one long marathon. This time we're taking a look at the fourth and final game in the series, Oddworld Stranger's Wrath. And just like the last game in the series that we've covered, Oddworld Munch's Odyssey, this one marked another substantial departure from the standard structure of the Oddworld games. But the question is this one actually a good game, or is it just one big mess? Oddworld Stranger's Wrath started development soon after Munch's Odyssey released and was an exclusive to the original Xbox. Exactly why it was an Xbox exclusive, I'm not sure. Maybe it was because of the contract they had taken with Microsoft to get Munch's Odyssey funded properly, which stated that the next 4 Oddworld games had to be Xbox-only titles. But it could also have been that the Oddworld Inhabitants team had previously found the PS2 difficult to work with and stuck to what they knew, having previous experience working with Xbox hardware with Munch's Odyssey. It could also be that the Xbox had more powerful hardware and it would have been difficult getting Stranger's Wrath working efficiently on the PS2. I'm not entirely sure what the reason for this exclusivity is, and there's very little information about the subject online. But the important thing here is that at the time it was initially released, in January 2005, it was an Xbox exclusive. As with my Munch's Odyssey review, I'm actually going to be taking a look at what you would consider to be the more definitive version of the game with Oddworld Stranger's Wrath HD, which was released in late 2011 for the PS3. There does exist other ports of Stranger's Wrath for the PC, PS Vita and mobile devices, as well as an upcoming version that's yet to be released on the Nintendo Switch. The version that I'm taking a look at today though for the PS3 was developed by Just Add Water and published by Oddworld Inhabitants, so it's the exact same setup that Oddworld Munch's Odyssey had. Let's just hope this one turns out better. The development of Stranger's Wrath was a lot smoother than Munch's Odyssey, perhaps due to them having learned how to utilise the hardware better, or perhaps having a better business deal in place with EA publishing the game. Because of this smoother production process, the game released to critical acclaim, getting 8s and 9s out of 10 practically across the board. However, despite this high praise, the game didn't sell very well, and Lorne Lanning, the creative director and writer of the Oddworld games, has stated that this is due to EA, the original publisher of the Xbox version of Stranger's Wrath, not marketing the game, which he suspects was because it was an Xbox exclusive and they only market games that are available on all consoles. This being because they will make more money being available to a much bigger audience by default. It's because of the bad sales of Stranger's Wrath that Oddworld Inhabitants disbanded for quite a substantial amount of time. After 2005, Oddworld wouldn't publish or develop a new game until 2010, when the PC versions of Stranger's Wrath and Munch's Odyssey were released. And there wouldn't be a brand new Oddworld experience until 2014, when the remake of Oddworld Abe's Odyssey, Oddworld New and Tasty, was released. What actually worked out quite well about this though is that when Stranger's Wrath was eventually re-released on the PS3, PS Vita, PC and for mobile devices, this actually gave Oddworld Inhabitants the funds they needed to publish New and Tasty, and then from there, that gave them the funds they needed to develop their upcoming game, Oddworld Soulstorm. So, Oddworld Stranger's Wrath, what is it? Well, unlike every previous game in the series so far, this one doesn't focus on Abe and instead is set in an entirely different location with a brand new main character. This character being the Stranger, who is a bounty hunter who lives in a Western-inspired environment. With this new character and location also comes a drastic change in gameplay, with Stranger's Wrath being an interesting mix of a 3D platformer, action-adventure, and first-person shooter. The way this works is that for the most part you'll be playing in third person to explore the world and platform your way around, but when in combat you'll be able to switch to first person and shoot by using your crossbow. It actually works incredibly well and feels really fluid and satisfying switching between the modes to suit the environment. But I think we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. How does the game actually start? Well, to be honest, there actually isn't that much of a story at the beginning of the game. The initial cutscene introduces us to the Stranger as he lays traps for an outlaw who has a bounty on his head, We then have a chase scene before the stranger captures his prey, and the game begins with you heading back into town to deliver the bounty. This beginning sequence is a tutorial section which teaches you the basics of combat and movement. Another very interesting aspect of this game is how you don't actually acquire new weapons, but rather you find new ammo for your crossbow which has different effects. And this ammo has to be hunted in the wilderness because it's actual living creatures. So yeah, you fire creatures out of your wrist-mounted crossbow to kill, knock out, or set traps for enemies, and it's pretty badass. The crossbow has 2 barrels too, meaning you can have 2 ammo types equipped at the same time, which sets you up for some interesting combinations. For example, you could use the chipunk, which lure enemies towards it, and then hide behind a corner and knock them out with a zap fly, or you could shoot a load of fuzzles onto the floor and wait for your enemies to walk over them, which basically functions like a living mine as you watch the fuzzles rip them to pieces as they get close. The ammo types also open up yet another interesting mechanic to the game, where you can choose whether to kill enemies or capture them alive. Killing them is beneficial because, obviously, once they're dead, they're no threat and won't get up again and shoot you in the back. But knocking them out and capturing them alive will result in you getting a much higher reward when you bring your bounty back to town. I personally captured as many enemies as I could alive because it felt a lot more rewarding, but you can basically play the game how you want. Another element of this free combat is how you can use a pretty rudimentary stealth system to take down your enemies one by hiding in tall grass and picking them off, and then you can attempt to capture them while no one else is watching. Or you could treat it like a more traditional shooter and just run in all guns blazing. It's really up to you how slowly and methodically, or how quickly and ruthlessly you want to play it, and I think that's pretty cool. When you get to town, you're free to explore the area and visit the bounty store to find more outlaws to capture, or you could visit the general store where you can buy ammo, bags which extend how much ammo you can carry, attractors which lure more creatures out for you to hunt, clip extenders, binoculars, stamina boosters, armor, and more. It's pretty extensive and gives you a reason to be collecting as much money as you possibly can, so then you can get all of the upgrades that you want. I do kinda wish that there was some cosmetic changes you could make to the stranger, like new hats and clothes and stuff. I feel like that would have added to my immersion of the game, but hey, it's not too big of a deal, and it's not like the rewards presented aren't sufficient as it is. What I do find slightly disappointing is that there's practically nothing else you can do in any of the towns. Despite almost being laid out like an open world in these areas, there's no side quests or optional activities for you to take part in, which is a bit of a shame. I feel like this could have been such a good thing to include to increase your playtime and flesh out the world even more, and I just think it would have really fit in with the game's structure too. This isn't something I say very often about games at all. In fact, I normally say the exact opposite, but I really think this game could have benefited from having an open world design, rather than just having these open world-esque sections inside of the towns, and then having a more linear design outside of that. Having an open world would have made it so that there could have been side quests, and it also would have made it so that you could have explored the world and found secrets on your own, rather than kind of being guided to them in the main story. It's at this point where the game's structure for almost the entire game presents itself. Basically, you go to the bounty store, select which bounty you want to do, and this functions basically like starting a new level. So a new linear path will open going outside of the town area, you get to the end of that path, having to fight outlaws along the way, and then face off against your bounty in the form of a boss fight. Then you go back to the bounty store and repeat this until you run out of bounties, and then move over to the next town and repeat. I'm simplifying the game quite a lot with this explanation, but that's pretty much what you do to progress in the game. However, where the game excels here is in all the little interesting things it does within this structure. For example, sometimes you'll be told who your bounty is, but leave the store not knowing where to even begin looking. So by pressing square, you can actually ask the NPC characters getting on with the day-to-day lives where to go next, and they'll either give you directions or give you some form of hint for you to work it out yourself.
Hey, you know where I might find a fella named Scuzz?
Oh, that guy. Guess he'd be where any outlaw be in town. in them dang sewers.
You can also sometimes find your way by following signs dotted around the towns, which feels much more rewarding and immersive than just having a waypoint appear on a minimap. Outside of the towns and in the actual levels, you'll eventually start coming across new enemies. Some of them will have machine guns or snipers, there'll be armoured enemies which deal huge melee damage, there's suicide bomber enemies, and a lot more. And this constantly keeps the combat fresh because you'll be having to prioritise different enemies and come up with new plans depending on the situation. Another element of tactics which comes into the combat is how you can sometimes manipulate the environment to affect enemies. For example, you can shoot exploding barrels, lure enemies onto weak flooring so that they fall, or mess with machinery to drop stuff on enemies' heads. All of this combined with the different ammo types which all have very different functions, both passive and aggressive, and the choice about whether to kill or knock enemies out actually ends up making the combat feel really deep, and it's always fun to take part in. Which is something I find a lot of shooters struggle with because there's only so many times you can clear rooms of enemies without it getting boring. But there's enough going on here in the combat and outside of it to keep it feeling amazing. We also have the boss enemies who have their own personalities, and this is represented not only through the cutscenes but also through the gimmicks that they use to fight. So for example, one is a sniper who tries to kill you from afar, one is in a mech suit that you can only hit from behind by getting above them, one is a technician and has a shield which has to be deactivated before you can attack them, one has a rocket launcher and does a wrestling move on you if you get too close, and there's loads more. Within the levels themselves there's quite a bit of variety, with some focusing more on platforming, some having a greater emphasis on stealth, some having wild inhabitants attack you rather than outlaws. There's a cool minecart section in a couple of the levels where the game turns into an on-rail shooter. Basically, despite on paper the game structure sounding maybe a little bit boring and repetitive, it does everything it can inside of this core structure, and it ends up never becoming boring in the slightest. This is helped by the fact that it's not too long either. Looking at you, Munch's Odyssey. I can definitely see this being a huge hit as a Switch game because it's actually pretty well suited to a handheld experience, because the individual levels, or bounties, aren't too long. So you could easily pick it up, do one level, and then stop if you had to. I'm actually quite surprised revisiting this game because, well, I don't remember it being quite this good. It's aged extremely well, and this comes not only down to its original and inventive gameplay, but also its graphics. The graphics in Stranger's Wrath are actually pretty damn incredible. Remember, this was originally an Xbox game, and I'm aware that this is a remaster, so it obviously looks better than it did on the original hardware, but still, it holds up pretty well even to this day. It looks like a fairly high-budget PS3 title rather than from the generation before that. Some of the environments are really cool to just look at and take in, and the game does an awesome job of nailing the whole cowboy aesthetic while still being otherworldly at the same time. I love the attention to detail with the shop signs being all old-worldy, and how the general store sign will light up if there's anything new in stock. And the Stranger's animation is incredible for the time. I love how he goes onto all fours to sprint if you run solidly for a short amount of time. The speed boost is always satisfying and keeps the game's pace up. There's also an attempt at environmental storytelling with stuff like this area I came across, where creatures had been strung up for fishing in outlaw territory, and then displayed as a signal to keep other people out. Or this part where a farm is attacked, and you see that the outlaws have been cooking and eating the chicken people, who are the main citizens of the game, which is actually pretty messed up if you analyse it. There's quite a bit of visual variety too, going through junkyards, sewers, farms, desert areas, forests, rivers, and cities, which is awesome because you're constantly wanting to see where you're going next. I'm really happy to report that the sound design is pretty good in this game too, unlike in Munch's Odyssey where it's unacceptably bad. Not only do we have the option of subtitles this time around, but to be honest, we don't even need them, because, hallelujah, you can hear what people are saying. Background chatter and noises even fade out when you begin talking to NPCs, so you can more clearly hear the conversation, which is highly appreciated.
Pretty far from town, ain't you?
Oh, well, we're cleaning up this here farm. Stash some moolah here before they cleared out.
Plus, the general sound effects of all of the ammo types you can use, your melee attack impacts, footsteps, and environmental ambience all sound great, and keep you grounded in the game. The music too is incredible, being very western inspired with tribal drum beats and reverby electric guitar twangs going off every now and then. They just completely and utterly nailed the whole western vibe that this game was going for, which is great because it's something you don't see attempted that much in games, outside of the Red Dead series. So I'm glad they got it right. Plus, you've got to love the stranger's voice. It's bassy as hell and comes across as very cliché to the western genre, but I love it and it works really well.
Put 'em up where I can see 'em. Look here, I'm just looking for a fella. Goes by a Scuzz. Well, you found him. Now what do you want? I'm after Palooka. I needs to get in the junkyard. Palooka, huh? Well, to get that two-timing punk, you're gonna need a password. The password is... Whoa, did you just say... Yep. That's it! Get that double-crossing jackass!
Another aspect of the music I love is how it once again is a dynamic soundtrack, which has actually been a feature present in every Oddworld game. So when you're in stealth, there will be a different, more tense soundtrack than when you're in full-on combat. But the two tracks bleed into each other, so it's like the music has been specifically made to suit your actions. This is obviously not a huge deal nowadays because a lot of games do this, but at the time this was released, it still wasn't being done all too often. It's a great touch. The controls too are just superb. Everything works exactly like you would expect in both third person and first person, and I was pleasantly surprised by how fluid going from one mode to the other felt, despite the controls being different in each of these modes. It just feels natural. Oh, and another thing that makes this game so much better than Munch's Odyssey is the fact that you can invert the Y and X axis camera controls. Why basic functions like this were absent from Munch's Odyssey, I've got no idea. But anyway, enough hating on that game. I do hate it though. I've pretty much covered the entire game at this point. It's just a great game, even better than I remember it being, and it shows that Oddworld Inhabitants was still at the top of the game. Not only that, but it also shows that they could tackle brand new game genres and reinvent them, put them in the Oddworld universe, and make it work. In fact, not only make it work, but make it work damn well too. That being said, I do have a few negative things to say about the game, but a lot of these could be considered nitpicks or simply a result of when the game was released, making certain features unable to be implemented. So I've already mentioned how I think the game could have greatly benefited from being fully open world and implementing more side quests to give the game a bit more content and expand its universe. I also think that the game could have had more vehicle sections, because as it stands there are only really two of these, the previously mentioned minecar and something which I'll talk about later in the review. Going back to the open world aspect, I feel like if the game had been designed like this, then some sort of horse equivalent would have been a nice touch. Maybe even bring back Elam, but a more western inspired version. That would have been awesome. But putting the whole open world thing to the side, there are a couple of other issues that aren't related to that. For example, I think that the stranger's swimming speed could have been made much faster. There's not a lot of swimming in the game, so it's not a huge deal, but on the few occasions where you need to take a dip, it's painfully slow moving him anywhere. The frame rate of the HD version is a little bit inconsistent too. While the game runs perfectly fine most of the time, there are examples in heavy combat or when the game is loading in a new area where it will stutter, and it's actually extremely noticeable. Speaking of the loading, something that I love about Stranger's Wrath is that like Abe's Odyssey and Exodus, there's very few visible loading screens. They pretty much only happen when you first start the game or when you die and get taken back to a checkpoint or a quick save. The quick save mechanic being another returning feature, which I actually used quite a lot. The game seems to load in areas while you're moving the stranger through corridor sections. Kinda similarly to how Tony Hawk's American Wasteland advertised itself as not having loading screens, when in actuality they were just disguised in the gameplay in linear, almost on rails sequences. But anyway, back to the negatives. The stranger lets out a noise every single time he jumps, and it's not like the sound effect itself is bad, but it really didn't need to happen every single time you jump, and it starts to come across as a bit goofy when you picture him doing it literally every time he leaps. But perhaps the biggest issue with the game comes down to its difficulty. It's a pretty damn difficult game to finish, and every single enemy actually poses quite a big threat. Luckily, the game does have difficulty options, which is a first for the Oddworld series, but at the same time, I feel like difficulty options are always a bit lazy. For me personally, I like it when a game is designed so that there's only one difficulty, so you know that's the intended experience that the developers intended. It's about getting the difficulty curve right so that the player is challenged, but at the same time has the skills taught to them earlier in the game to feel like they're not overwhelmed, which is obviously difficult to do. Then there's also the whole accessibility aspect, where obviously certain people playing games have drastically different skill levels, so maybe having difficulty options is a good idea to cater to as many people as possible. I don't know. Either way though, I've finished this game on hard before, and I remember it genuinely being quite difficult. And even on normal difficulty, which is what I played it on for this review, I found myself dying quite often. I don't have an issue with the difficulty of the standard fights against the random outlaws, but where I think the game should have maybe been tweaked slightly is in the boss battles. In order to capture them alive, you need to drain the stamina meter by using non-fatal ammo types. Mostly this boils down to using the Zapfly for the whole fight. But their stamina meters can recharge insanely quickly sometimes, and it can result in knocking them down a substantial amount, then having to retreat to heal, only to have the stamina fully charged before you get any time to breathe. I think this stamina regeneration should have been lowered quite a bit, because it can be a bit irritating basically having to start the fight from square one again after whittling them down already. The last criticism I have of the game comes down to the story, and don't get me wrong, I actually do like the story that's presented here, it's just the elements of it come across as rushed and underdeveloped, and I kinda wish more happened in the first 2 acts of the game. So let's run through what happens. Basically, the reason the stranger is collecting all of these bounties is because he needs to have an operation, but the details of the operation are kept as a mystery. The only thing we know is that it's vital to the stranger's survival and needs to be kept on the down low for some reason. Luckily, there's a Vicar in town called Doc who's willing to perform this shady operation, but to do it he's asking for 20,000 moolah, which is the currency in the Oddworld games. And the stranger has nowhere near that amount. The first 2 acts of the game are simply about the stranger collecting bounties and eventually getting enough money for the operation. Along the way you'll build up notoriety, and the townsfolk grow quite fond of you for getting rid of so many outlaws. You'll also learn a little bit about a tribe of creatures called grubs, who are pretty similar to Mudokons in that the homes are being slowly destroyed and they're being killed by the growing industry in the area. While going through one of their old temples, you learn that creatures called Steef used to serve as guardians to the grubs, but seemingly all of the Steef have been killed off, leaving the grubs defenseless. It's in the 3rd and final act of the game where a major plot development happens, and the game actually turns its back on the whole bounty structure that we've been seeing up until this point. This makes the plot development really impactful because it not only affects the overarching story, but it also affects the gameplay. So basically, the owner of a nearby dam, which is the biggest industrial facility in the area, whose name is Secto and is a member of the Octoguy species which is related to the Gluckons, learns of the stranger and sets a bounty to kill a Steef and return with its head for his collection of Steef trophies. The stranger takes this bounty, seemingly knowing where to find a Steef, However, Secto also hires an outlaw to find the stranger, now being aware that he knows where a Steve is. The stranger heads over to the dock's barge where his operation can take place, only to find that the dock has been murdered and hung. The stranger's only hope of his life-saving operation is now gone, and to make matters worse, he gets captured by the outlaw hired by Secto and is about to be tortured to reveal the location of the Steve. However, the stranger's operation notes are dropped while he's tied up and unable to move, and the outlaw discovers that the operation was going to amputate the stranger's back legs and fuse them to his front legs, therefore making him a two-legged creature. But wait a minute, the stranger already has 2 legs, right? Well, confused about the situation, the outlaw takes the stranger's pants off, only to reveal that he does in fact have 4 legs, and he's been the Steve all along. He's been getting operations to disguise himself and be able to live a normal life without being hunted and shunned by the public. The stranger's bonds are then destroyed by a tribe of grubs and the building is set on fire. The stranger kills everyone who knows his identity, but while running away, he's spotted by the townsfolk who are now either terrified of him or are trying to kill him for the bounty money. The people you've been working so hard to protect for the entire game no longer even recognise you and are hunting you down relentlessly. Eventually though, the stranger escapes and finds a grub temple, where they ask for his help to stop Secto from destroying their homes. As the last remaining Steve, he's the only hope they've got. And this is where the game's structure changes completely, no longer being about collecting bounties, but about resistance warfare. You'll be taking down dropships sent by Secto to eliminate you and the grubs, you'll be protecting ancient temples and rescuing resistance leaders, and eventually you'll take a boat directly to Secto's dam. This boat being the vehicle that I mentioned earlier, which actually controls really well, feeling similar to the boat in the 2018 God of War. You fight your way through the dam, facing off against Secto's guards, who are a species called Gloctogai, and seem to be squid-like creatures attached to robotic legs. They look quite threatening, but surprisingly, they're quite easy to put down, maybe due to the ammo and armor upgrades you've been receiving from the grubs throughout this part of the game. Anyway, you finally find Secto in his office and face off against 2 Gloctogai at the same time, again being quite an easy fight to be honest, before confronting Secto himself, who uses a shield generator to hide while firing lasers at you. Meanwhile, the grubs have also infiltrated the dam and are slowly destroying it from the inside and with catapults. Before the Secto fight, you actually need to run through an area that's about to blow up as a timer ticks down due to these catapult shots causing so much destruction. And this is of course an awesome throwback to the final sections of Abe's Odyssey and Exodus, which also ended with timed sequences. Getting back to the point though, you destroy the shield generator which is protecting Secto, which is actually pretty easy. And that's actually it. Secto is then seemingly crushed by debris falling from the ceiling. I have to say, despite the last section of the game being awesome because of the change of pace going from bounties to all-out war, the last boss fight is actually a little bit anticlimactic, and I feel like what should have happened is he should have had a one-on-one fight with Secto rather than just facing off against a shield machine. It would have been more satisfying and conclusive that way. After Secto is seemingly dead, the stranger holds up his body and lets out a roar, telling the grubs that they've won. However, the dam starts falling to pieces with the stranger still inside, leaving us unaware of his fate. At a later point in time, the dam is shown to have released all of the water that it was holding, giving the grubs back their freedom and allowing the home to be rebuilt. The stranger is then shown as being alive, so that whole death fake out thing didn't last very long. And he heads over to Secto's body, which is washed onto the land just next to the dam, only to discover he has hooves? Secto is revealed to be a Steve, who asks if the water is free. The stranger tells him that it is, and he dies, content in knowing that he didn't die as a villain. A weird octopus creature is then shown watching in the distance, and it swims away ominously. Wait, what just happened exactly? So yeah, when I finished the game I actually had forgotten about this part of the game, which is nice because I wasn't expecting Secto to be a Steve all along. The thing is, I really feel like this part of the story isn't very well explained in the slightest, and you really have to read between the lines to get what's been going on. Basically, Secto is the octopus thing seen at the end, which is the Octoguy, and the way that Octoguy operate is that they attach themselves to a host and take control of them, basically like a parasite. So the Steef at the end of the game that dies was the old protector of the grubs, but was taken over by Secto. And I guess by using the power of a Steef, he took over this area and eventually built the dam. It's a bit weird though, because we're never told or shown that this is what the Octoguy do, so it just comes across as a bit random. I also find it a bit weird how the game ends on a bit of a cliffhanger, with Secto not being dead and just swimming away. Like this is supposed to be a self-contained Oddworld game, it should have just have had a definitive end. But whatever, I guess. Even with that bit of a dodgy ending though, Stranger's Wrath is still an awesome game, and it's a shame that EA didn't market it properly, because rather than being a big hit like it should have been, it's more of a hidden gem. Still, it might get its time in the spotlight with the upcoming Nintendo Switch release, and I really hope it does, because it does deserve it. I'm giving Stranger's Wrath an 8 out of 10. It's such an interesting concept at its core. A first-person shooter platformer hybrid where you hunt for living ammo and can choose to be lethal or not, and being a western while also being set on a distant planet where the citizens are chicken people. It's unbelievably original and might even sound so far-fetched that it wouldn't work, but the genius of Oddworld really comes through here because it all blends together perfectly for a really engaging and immersive game that was maybe even a bit ahead of its time. This game gives me hope that one day Oddworld Inhabitants will return to 3D game design, but create something on a bigger scale than we've ever seen before, and potentially even surpass this game or anything they've done previously. There's really only a few little issues, like the frame rate dropping, lack of side quests or optional things to do. Like you could have gone into bars and played card games or something. There's no cosmetic customization and there's not much story development until quite late into the game. But really, you can overlook most of this with how polished the rest of the game is. If you've never played this game before and it looks interesting, you should 100% pick it up and give it a go. Like I said before, I really hope that the upcoming Switch version does well and introduces a bigger audience to the game. So that not only wraps up this Stranger's Wrath video, but it also wraps up Oddtober itself. We've gone through the 4 main Oddworld games, and all of them have been pretty consistently great, apart from the one blip that is Munch's Odyssey. There are actually another 4 Oddworld games left for me to cover, so if you'd be interested in me doing a follow-up to this marathon, let me know in the comments below, because I think it would be interesting. We've still got the 3 Oddworld Game Boy games, and Oddworld New and Tasty that I could cover too. There is also the upcoming Oddworld Soulstorm, but I'll probably review that just on its own outside of a marathon because I'm so excited to give it a go. So, that about wraps everything up, and I'll see you in whatever video will be coming next. Bye!